The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel glittered under a constellation of crystal chandeliers, their light refracting into 1,000 fragments across the polished marble floors. The air was heavy with perfume, champagne, and the faint hum of self-importance. Manhattan's elite glided past in designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos, their laughter melodic but rehearsed, punctuated by the subtle clink of expensive jewelry. At the center of it all stood Alexander Sterling, a figure of effortless command. At 32, he had amassed a tech empire worth $12 billion. Yet tonight, as he surveyed the throng of admirers, an unfamiliar hollowness pressed against the edges of his chest. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, exchanging pleasantries and nods, all polished smiles and carefully modulated words, yet inside a subtle, gnawing disquiet whispered that none of this, the money, the accolades, the perfectly orchestrated admiration, could ever reach anything real. Alexander's blue eyes, sharp and calculating, skimmed the room almost reflexively, taking in the glimmering sea of privilege. Everything was curated, the ice sculptures shaped like musical notes, the symphony-themed gala, the rare wines and caviar. Everything except the emptiness that clung to him like an invisible shroud. He adjusted his black Tom Ford tuxedo, the fabric soft but perfectly structured, and flexed the wrist adorned with his Patek Philippe watch, its understated elegance reflecting his obsession with perfection. He was a king in a crystal castle, and yet something in him ached for a connection deeper than flattery or admiration. Meanwhile, near the grand oak doors, a small figure pressed against the shadows. Ethan Clark, no more than 8 years old, moved with hesitant steps that belied a quiet courage. His jeans were torn at the knees, sneakers held together by what looked like electrical tape, and an oversized hoodie carried the faint, stubborn stains of nights spent in alleys and subway stations. Despite the grime and wear, his hazel eyes held a glint that seemed older than his years, sharp and intelligent, scanning the room with a mixture of awe and determination. Somewhere amid the glittering opulence, he had seen the massive Bosendorfer piano at the center of the ballroom, its ebony surface polished so perfectly, it reflected the chandeliers like a dark mirror. That piano was a siren call he could not ignore. The boy's small heart hammered as he ducked behind a potted palm, edging closer to the polished marble floors that led to the piano. He had survived on scraps, endured nights of biting cold and hunger, yet this moment, this improbable opportunity, felt almost sacred. His fingers itched with anticipation, craving the feel of keys beneath them even as every step carried the risk of being caught and expelled. The security guards, towering figures in black suits, moved with deliberate efficiency through the crowd, their eyes scanning for trouble. And then, almost instinctively, one of them noticed the slight movement at the periphery, a shadow flitting past the doorway. "Hey," the guard muttered, shifting toward the figure. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, gaze locked on the piano that seemed impossibly large, impossibly perfect. He took a deep breath, squared his narrow shoulders, and continued forward, each step deliberate as if the marble floor were a tightrope stretched over his entire life. The music inside him, built from years of subway practice and stolen moments on broken pianos, whispered encouragement. Every luxurious detail around him, the laughter, the gowns, the glittering lights, was a universe apart from his own. Yet he advanced, propelled by a single, undeniable certainty. He could play. And perhaps if he could play, the world, or at least one man in it, might finally see him. Alexander, meanwhile, remained unaware of the small intruder inching through the crowd. He raised a glass to a smiling socialite, his smile polished, his words effortless. But across the ballroom, two worlds, fragile and unlikely, were about to collide. The chandeliers shimmered like frozen waterfalls above the crowd. But for Ethan, the glittering lights felt like a barrier, a kingdom of glass and gold that he wasn't meant to enter. Each step toward the Bosendorfer piano made his stomach tighten, not from fear alone, but from the impossible audacity of what he was about to attempt. He could hear the muffled laughter and the soft clink of champagne glasses behind him, the symphony of wealth and safety that he had never known, and yet, the piano called to him as if it recognized a kindred spirit in the way no human ever had. The security guard's eyes narrowed, and he began to stride toward Ethan, his posture the exact balance of authority and menace. The boy's pulse quickened. If he was stopped now, if this moment slipped away, he would retreat to the subway tunnels, to the cold tiles and the familiar echoes of coins dropped in hats, but he wouldn't have tried. Not fully. Ethan's hand brushed against the polished leg of a velvet chair, grounding him. He raised his chin, the faintest quiver betraying both fear and determination. This was his gamble, his one shot, and he would not shrink from it. He imagined the keys beneath his fingers, the way they could sing or scream, the way a single note could bridge the chasm between who he was and who the world might finally see him as. From across the room, Alexander's attention flickered. He had been nodding politely to a conversation about tax write-offs and philanthropy strategies when something in the periphery caught his eye, a small, deliberate movement, almost imperceptible amid the shimmering gowns and tuxedos. For a moment his mind resisted what he saw. Another child. Here impossible. The gala was carefully curated, invitations vetted to the last detail. And yet there it was. A slight figure weaving through the crowd with all the grace of someone invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Ethan stopped for a heartbeat beneath a towering sculpture of ice, his gaze locking on the massive piano. Every fiber of him screamed to run, to hide, to retreat to safety, but he forced his legs forward. The guard had taken another step, his polished shoes echoing like hammers against the marble. Ethan froze, assessing. The hallway of light and privilege stretched ahead like a tunnel he had no right to enter. But he remembered the subway. He remembered the old battered piano that had become his sanctuary, the one that whispered that the world could be transformed if he just let the music speak. Alexander's curiosity sharpened into something he hadn't felt in years, genuine intrigue. He turned subtly, adjusting his tie, and observed the boy more closely. The child moved with a strange rhythm, a cautious grace that suggested both fear and audacity. There was something in the intensity of those hazel eyes, a mixture of hunger, defiance, and intelligence that commanded attention. Alexander's chest tightened. There was a memory stirring, buried somewhere beneath the layers of his success, a recollection of vulnerability, of struggle, of someone smaller than life but unbroken by it. The guard reached out, his voice firm but not cruel. "Son, you shouldn't be here. Please step back." Ethan paused, not out of obedience but as if weighing the world behind that warning against the world he had imagined at the piano. Then, with a courage that was both terrifying and beautiful, he stepped forward anyway, his voice small but steady, cut through the murmurs of champagne-soaked conversations. "Please. I don't want money. I need to eat. I can play something. I can make it beautiful. Just let me try." A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. Some laughed, a few whispered, others stared in shocked silence. Alexander, though, felt a prickle of something deeper than surprise. Recognition. Challenge. A moral reckoning that came unbidden, clawing through the carefully maintained layers of his meticulously constructed life. Ethan's small hands hovered above the polished keys, and for the first time that night, the ballroom seemed to exhale, holding its breath. Every expensive gown, every tailored tuxedo, every crystal light fixture faded into the background, leaving only the boy, the piano, and the fragile promise that something miraculous could happen here. Tonight, against every expectation. The guard hesitated. Alexander's gaze fixed, and the room seemed to tilt toward a single, impossible question. What happens when someone refuses to be invisible in a world that insists they remain so? Ethan pressed a finger against the first key. The note rang out, fragile, almost tentative, but undeniably alive. The moment suspended itself, a heartbeat stretched across marble, crystal, and glass, and the collision of two worlds, one gilded and untouchable, one ragged and extraordinary, began. The single key vibrated beneath Ethan's fingertip, trembling like the first breath of a creature awakening. The note hung in the air, fragile yet defiant, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to forget itself. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The socialites, bankers, and art collectors who had dominated the room with their laughter and self-importance froze, unsure whether to intervene, to laugh, or to simply watch. All eyes turned toward the boy, his small frame hunched over the piano like a soldier facing impossible odds. Ethan's second finger pressed down. The sound was clearer now, stronger, as if the piano recognized him, understood him, and responded to the years he had spent coaxing music from battered subway keys. Each note he played carried fragments of his life. The sting of hunger, the biting cold of the streets, the whispered lullabies he had imagined for himself in abandoned corners of Manhattan. And yet there was something more. An innate brilliance, a grace that could not have been taught, a soul that spoke through melody instead of words. Alexander Sterling stepped closer. His eyes, normally so sharp and precise, softened as he watched Ethan play. He had always been a man of control, of calculation, of meticulously orchestrated success. Yet here, in this glittering cage of wealth and pretense, he felt powerless, an intruder in the raw honesty of a child's music. His chest tightened, a strange mixture of awe, guilt, and something he hadn't felt in years. Wonder. The security guard hovered near the edge of the piano, tension written across his features. He was trained to maintain order, to uphold the rules of the elite world that Ethan had just invaded, yet even he seemed caught in the spell of the music. He leaned slightly, unwilling to interrupt, uncertain whether this small boy was a threat or a revelation. Ethan's confidence grew with each note. His hands moved like dancers across the ivory, commanding yet delicate. He played not just what he had practiced, but what he had lived, a symphony of struggle, hope, and unbroken spirit. There was an audacity in it, a daring that demanded recognition. The audience, at first dismissive, began to shift in their seats. Eyes widened. Glasses clinked softly as if in involuntary applause. Whispers spread. "He's really good. No way. Is this possible?" And then came the first moment of real danger. A high society matron, her voice sharp and dripping with condescension, broke the spell. "Security. This is absurd. He's trespassing." The room's tension snapped. Several guests murmured in agreement, their smug amusement returning as if to remind themselves that, despite the piano's voice, the social order must remain intact. Alexander felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing on him, the pressure to maintain decorum, to shield his reputation, to silence disruption before it became scandal. His instincts urged him to intervene, to stop the boy, to restore control. But he didn't. Instead, he moved subtly closer, positioning himself between Ethan and the socialite. The power in the room shifted imperceptibly. For the first time in decades, Alexander made a decision not for strategy, not for profit, but for something human, something urgent, something real. Ethan sensed it. He glanced up briefly, meeting Alexander's gaze. The smallest nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a lifeline. And then Ethan played as if the piano itself depended on him, the notes cascading, urgent and alive, telling stories that words could never reach. The ballroom, once an arena of vanity, became a sanctuary of raw emotion. Every chandelier, every polished floor, every gilded wall reflected not wealth, but the power of an untrained hand shaping genius. Whispers became awe, skepticism became wonder. Alexander felt it deep in his chest, a painful, thrilling recognition that life's most valuable treasures were not ledger entries or accolades, but moments like this, moments when courage, talent, and humanity collided in defiance of expectation. And in that collision, Ethan, ragged and small, unarmed and unassuming, had conquered the impossible. He had made an entire room of the untouchable elite pause, hold their breath, and witness the extraordinary. Yet even as the music soared, Alexander's mind flickered to one unsettling thought. Who had this boy become, and why did he feel so profoundly familiar? The answer he did not yet know, but the first chords had sounded, and nothing in the grand ballroom would ever be the same again. The first notes had captivated the room, but what came next was something no one had anticipated. Ethan's fingers no longer hesitated. They danced across the keys with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a boy so young, so small, so out of place. Each chord carried weight, not just in sound but in story. The desperation of nights spent cold and alone, the fleeting joys of finding a coin tossed into a hat, the relentless determination that had carried him through every subway tunnel and alley. The piano did not merely echo his life. It amplified it, raw and unfiltered, until the gilded walls themselves seemed to hum in recognition. Alexander Sterling felt the world shift beneath him. The hollow structure of wealth, power, and reputation that had built his empire suddenly seemed fragile, brittle, as if it could crumble under the purity of the boy's music. He had spent his life perfecting control, surrounding himself with predictability. Yet here, in a room full of marble and crystal, a child was rewriting the rules. Alexander's chest tightened, his pulse quickened, and for the first time in decades he felt powerless and alive. Whispers erupted around the ballroom, low at first, then rising like a tide. He's incredible. Where did he learn to play like that? He's only 8 years old. The laughter and mockery that had greeted Ethan moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by awe and disbelief. Guests shifted in their seats, leaning forward instinctively, unable to look away. Even those who prided themselves on sophistication and detachment were caught, unwilling witnesses to a moment that defied everything their world represented. The security guard, who had moments before been poised to intercept the boy, froze, his jaw tight. He had seen talented children before, but never in a room like this, performing with such poise and authority. He glanced at Alexander for direction, but the billionaire's eyes were fixed on Ethan, wide and unblinking. The unspoken command was clear: do nothing. Let it happen. Ethan's eyes sparkled, not just with talent, but with defiance, pride, and the quiet hope that someone, anyone, would truly see him. He had never performed in a space like this, surrounded by silk, diamonds, and judgment. The piano was grand, enormous, intimidating, yet it seemed to recognize him, to bend to his will as he coaxed the most impossible melodies from its keys. Each note, each flourish built a bridge between worlds, between luxury and survival, privilege and desperation, skepticism and belief. Alexander's mind raced. He felt a surge of something he had long thought buried. Guilt, yes, but also recognition. Recognition of what it was to struggle, to fight unseen battles, to claw through life with nothing but will and talent as armor. And yet there was something more. Something in the boy's posture, in the subtle curve of his hands, the precise way he struck chords. It triggered a memory Alexander could not immediately place. A faint, haunting sense of familiarity, as if he had glimpsed this spirit before. Somewhere beyond time and circumstance, the murmurs of the guests had grown louder, their skepticism slowly melting into admiration. Some reached instinctively for their phones, capturing what they could barely believe. A child, ragged and small, mesmerizing a room that had never paused for anything outside wealth. A real-time miracle unfolding among crystal and marble, and then came the moment of tension that pulled every heart into the chasm of suspense. Ethan's hands faltered for a split second, a single discordant note breaking the flow, tiny and almost imperceptible. The room held its breath. In that pause, Alexander could feel the entire weight of expectation pressing down, not on Ethan but on himself. Could he protect this boy? Could he allow the world's judgment to ruin something that was more than performance? It was truth, unfiltered and radiant. Ethan's gaze flicked to Alexander, seeking permission, validation, connection. In that instant, Alexander's own heart answered. He nodded ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, and the boy's hand surged forward again, stronger, bolder, every note now tinged with uncontainable brilliance. The music swelled, a wave of emotion that crashed through the polished floor, the glittering chandeliers, and the carefully constructed walls of privilege. For the first time, Alexander realized something he had never fully admitted to himself. Power without compassion was hollow. Success without witness was meaningless. And brilliance, true brilliance, could appear anywhere, often where no one dared to look. The piano sang, the room held its breath, and two worlds collided in a crescendo of revelation, awe, and impossible beauty. The ballroom was no longer merely a room. It had become a crucible. Ethan's fingers moved like fire across the keys, coaxing melodies that were impossible to ignore. Each note carried fragments of a life spent in shadow, nights on cold sidewalks, the ache of empty stomachs, the silent witnesses of dim subway tunnels. And yet in the midst of deprivation, there was brilliance, unyielding and raw, spilling from him like sunlight through a crack in a concrete wall. The crowd shifted uneasily, some leaning forward in awe, others recoiling, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. Lady Patricia Huntington's delicate hand clutched at her emerald necklace as her lips parted in disbelief. "It can't be. A child?" she whispered, though even she could not suppress the tremor of wonder. A few socialites murmured, "It's genius," while the more hardened elites exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that their curated world, built on status and etiquette, was not enough to contain this. Alexander Sterling felt his own pulse hammering. He had always believed that influence, wealth, and precision could control everything in his orbit. But here, In this moment, a ragged boy with torn jeans and taped sneakers had seized the center of power. And it wasn't fear that coursed through him, but recognition. Recognition of struggle, of survival, of the unpolished brilliance that no ledger could ever measure. Yet alongside that recognition, a darker, sharper sensation gnawed at him. That sense of familiarity, a memory just beyond reach, refusing to surface fully. A murmur rippled through the room as the security guard finally stepped closer, as though reality itself demanded intervention. "Sir, he doesn't belong here," he said, voice low but firm. "We should stop him before—" "Stop him?" Alexander's words cut through the tension like a blade. His voice was calm, precise, but edged with authority that left no room for argument. "No, let him play." The guard froze. Alexander's eyes never left Ethan. There was a weight in that gaze, a silent command, a protection that was at once a shield and a challenge. The room held its collective breath, realizing for the first time that the billionaire's power did not extend to control over this moment, only his courage to let it exist. Ethan, sensing the unspoken protection, poured every ounce of himself into the music. He had been building to this crescendo for years, each stolen practice session in the subway, each note learned by trial and failure, now culminating in a symphony of defiance and grace. The music swelled, filling the chandeliers with resonance, wrapping the guests in a soundscape that defied class, age, and expectation. Every polished surface seemed to vibrate with truth, and the audience could feel it in their bones. Something extraordinary was happening, something that could not be bought or curated. Then came the challenge that would define the next moment. A rival socialite, her voice sharp and mocking, finally broke through the spell. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "This is a gala, not a circus. Remove him." The tension in the room snapped. Some guests laughed nervously, some murmured agreement, but Alexander felt a storm rise within him. The hollow, strategic life he had always controlled demanded order, demanded compliance, demanded a return to predictability. But a deeper, rawer force, the part of him that remembered struggle, vulnerability, and the impossible courage of youth, insisted otherwise. Alexander's eyes met Ethan's, and in that fleeting exchange, the world narrowed to 2 points of focus: the boy at the piano, small but unbreakable, and the man who had built empires but had never truly felt the weight of life until this instant. With a subtle, decisive motion, Alexander moved between Ethan and the intruding socialite, his presence a barrier, a declaration. The room froze. The rich and powerful were confronted with something they could not control, and in that frozen heartbeat, the rules of the gilded cage dissolved. Ethan's hand struck a chord that made the crystal chandeliers tremble, a note so full of determination and life that it seemed to ripple through every polished surface. Even those who had doubted him moments before could not ignore it. Gasps filled the room, eyes widened. Tears, unbidden and swift, traced down the cheeks of more than one guest. And then, for the first time, the subtle memory within Alexander surged forward, a spark of recognition in the hazel eyes, the way Ethan held himself, the rhythm of his hands. Something deeply personal, long buried, demanded attention. He felt it as a tightening in his chest, a collision of intuition and disbelief. The music built to a climax, a defiance against the world's disbelief, and an invitation to see the impossible. The ballroom's elite, normally insulated from reality, could not look away. And in that moment, Alexander realized, this boy was not just extraordinary. He was unmistakably, in ways he could not yet articulate, familiar. The next note, poised between revelation and chaos, would bring everything to the surface. The room was taut with anticipation, the very air vibrating with the boy's music. Ethan's small hands moved with astonishing precision, commanding the piano as though it were an extension of his own body, his soul pouring through every note. The melodies he wove were no longer mere music, they were a story, a confession, an unspoken demand that the world recognize him for what he was. Unbroken, brilliant and human, Alexander Sterling felt it in his chest, a shattering weight that both exhilarated and terrified him. He had built empires from intellect, strategy, and ruthlessness, yet this child, ragged and trembling with life, held a power far greater than any he had ever wielded. Every chord forced him to confront the hollow perfection of his own existence, the wealth, the accolades, the seamless reputation, and see them for what they truly were: fragile, meaningless without connection, without risk. without authenticity. The elite guests, at first scandalized, now leaned forward, hypnotized. Gasps rippled through the room as Ethan's hands danced across the keys, shifting seamlessly between thunderous crescendos and delicate whispers, each note capturing pain, joy, and triumph. The grandeur of the chandeliers, the cold perfection of marble, the meticulously polished walls, all of it faded into insignificance compared to the raw, undeniable truth of what the boy was creating. Even the security guard, who had spent years enforcing order and etiquette, felt the hair rise on his arms, the tightness in his chest. For once, authority was powerless against authenticity. Alexander's mind raced, memories flickering like lightning. The set of Ethan's jaw, the determination in his eyes, the rhythm of his fingers. They were echoes of someone he had known long ago, someone from a life he thought he had left behind. His pulse hammered in recognition, fear, and disbelief. Could it be possible? Could this boy, standing barefoot in spirit, if not in appearance, be tied to a past he had tried to forget? Then it happened. A subtle gesture. Ethan's hand paused, fingers hovering over the keys, a particular flourish executed with uncanny familiarity. Alexander's breath caught. That movement, that rhythm was unmistakable. It was the same gesture his sister had described years ago, the same subtle inflection in a musical phrase that only a gifted family member could replicate. His mind raced, connecting pieces he hadn't realized were linked, a puzzle of memory and intuition snapping into place. The music surged to its peak, a storm of emotion that left the room suspended between awe and disbelief. Tears welled in the eyes of more than one socialite, and the laughter and whispered judgment that had once threatened Ethan now dissolved into stunned silence. Even Lady Patricia Huntington, herself a symbol of untouchable privilege, had frozen, her hand pressed lightly to her lips, eyes wide. Alexander stepped closer, drawn as though by an invisible cord. Every instinct screamed caution, yet another part of him, a part he rarely let surface, recognized the truth. There was more at stake here than reputation or social order. This was recognition, connection, destiny. He realized he could no longer remain a spectator to what was unfolding. The boy's music was not only extraordinary, it was personal, intimately tied to the very core of his own history. Ethan's final chord hung in the air, delicate yet impossibly strong, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers and marble floor. The room held its breath, suspended in reverence. Alexander's hand almost unconsciously reached toward his chest as if to steady the surge of revelation inside him. He had known success, power, and admiration, but none of it had ever touched him like this. This was not talent displayed for entertainment. This was truth, a force that could not be bought, coerced, or ignored. And then he saw it, the flicker of recognition in Ethan's eyes, the exact same way his own mother had looked at him in childhood, a mixture of hope, defiance, and unspoken history. The music had stopped, but the revelation thundered louder than any symphony. Alexander understood, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, that the boy at the piano was not merely a stranger. He was, in some unexplainable, life-altering way, connected to him, bound to his past, bound to his heart. The room waited for reaction, for applause, for judgment, but Alexander's voice cut through before anyone else could move. Quiet, commanding, yet filled with awe, he said, "Ethan Clark?" The boy's fingers stilled, his gaze locking onto Alexander's with a mixture of recognition and cautious hope. The unspoken truth hung between them, larger than wealth, larger than music, larger than any expectation the glittering ballroom had ever contained. For the first time that night, Alexander Sterling felt powerless in the most human way imaginable, and it was beautiful. The ballroom was deathly still, the lingering echoes of Ethan's final note vibrating in every crystal and marble surface. For a moment it felt as if the world itself had stopped, as though the universe had bent on its axis just to witness what had unfolded. Alexander Sterling's chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the weight of recognition, the truth that had been clawing at him, sharpening its edges with each note Ethan had played. He took a tentative step forward, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor, and studied the boy with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. The music had been a declaration, a challenge, a confession, and in its resonance, Alexander could no longer deny the impossible connection gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Ethan Clark," Alexander said again, his voice firmer this time, echoing through the stunned hush of the room. "Do you understand who I am?" Ethan froze mid-step, hand still hovering near the piano keys, his hazel eyes searching Alexander's face. Recognition flickered across the boy's features. Hesitation, hope, disbelief, all mixed into a potent, raw expression that drew a collective gasp from the audience. "Alexander Sterling," Ethan said quietly, almost a whisper. I think so." The words were enough to shatter the fragile social veneer of the gala. Gasps, whispers, and murmurs cascaded through the room. The chandeliers seemed to tremble in the sudden tension. Guests leaned forward, their perfectly coiffed heads snapping toward the two figures at the center of the marble expanse, trying to comprehend what was happening. Some smiled nervously. Others whispered accusations of scandal. But all eyes were riveted on the improbable scene. A billionaire and a ragged child, locked in a silent recognition that transcended class, wealth, and expectation. Alexander's mind raced. The resemblance was undeniable. The subtle arch of the brow, the set of the jaw, the hands. Memories long buried, faces long forgotten, and connections he had thought lost forever surged to the surface. The boy before him, the musical genius who had upended his carefully ordered world, was not a random interloper. He was the son of his estranged brother, missing for years, lost in the chaos of a family dispute that had left Alexander unaware of his existence until now. Ethan was family. For the first time in his life, Alexander's carefully constructed composure faltered. He felt a shiver run through him as he stepped closer, closing the distance between privilege and poverty, power and vulnerability. You're my nephew," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Your father, We lost contact. I never knew." His voice trailed, overwhelmed by emotion, by the sudden collapse of years of control and detachment. Ethan's eyes glistened. He had known something in the marrow of his bones, an intuition that had guided him to this moment. Yet hearing the truth, feeling it, made the world tilt. I didn't know," he whispered. I thought I had no one." The music that had been the bridge between their worlds now became a bridge between hearts. Alexander reached out, a hand trembling with unaccustomed vulnerability, and rested it lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The boy flinched at first, then leaned into the contact, a tacit acknowledgement that the world had just shifted beneath them. The crowd was silent, caught in the gravity of the revelation. Luxury, power, and etiquette had no weight here. No one moved, no one dared speak, as if acknowledging the miracle of connection unfolding before them would somehow break it. Even Lady Patricia Huntington and her cohort of socialites, accustomed to controlling every narrative, were powerless to intervene in the truth that had crashed through their carefully curated reality. Alexander swallowed hard, feeling the tremor of responsibility that had nothing to do with money or influence. "Ethan, your life doesn't have to be the streets anymore. We will make sure you have every opportunity, every chance to shine, not for anyone else but for yourself." The boy's fingers twitched over the piano keys, still carrying the power and clarity of his music. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt alive in a way no boardroom victory, no stock acquisition, no gala could ever provide. He had lost control, yes, but in that loss, he had found something infinitely greater: family, purpose, and the undeniable truth that brilliance and courage often appear in the most unlikely of places. The final, haunting realization settled over the room. Wealth, influence, and privilege were powerless against authenticity. Music had revealed the truth, and in its echo, two worlds, one gilded and cold, the other ragged but extraordinary, had collided, forever altering the lives of both the boy at the piano and the man who had built an empire, only to discover that life's greatest treasures cannot be bought or commanded. Ethan looked up at Alexander, eyes bright with emotion, and said softly, I want to play for the world, not just for me." Alexander smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that had not touched his face in years. "Then we'll make sure everyone hears you. But first, tonight the world hears the truth." The applause began slowly, almost tentatively, then swelled, a roaring acknowledgement of the impossible, the extraordinary, the inevitable collision of talent, courage, and human connection. And as the lights of the chandeliers danced across the marble, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his gilded world would ever be the same again.